Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to organisers for inviting me to speak at this wonderful conference. What a thing, slavery on the seas. Actually, the phrase chills you to the bone is something that it really does. You can't think of a more vulnerable community of people who don't have anywhere to run to, no one to ask for help, and no one to save them. So in terms of what's going on in the world, of course there are a few cases that have come to light, whether it's been the use of slavery in the supply chains for prawns, and even in other fields, which, for example, Liz Ford will be talking about, the work of the Gangmasters Licensing and Abuse Authority. I think in some ways, we're at the beginning of litigation in this field and really understanding how to litigate. There are so many obstacles, not least extraterritorial jurisdiction and the absence of it on the high seas. So maybe the solution is actually to think out of the box, more towards moral leadership, creativity, and more than anything, having smart solutions to save the sailors. I just wanted to tell you then a little bit of where the Thai prawn case has got to, and with my acknowledgements to Annie Kelly, who runs the Guardian's Modern Slavery Hub, which, as you know, started the story a few years ago. She reported recently that Thailand's billion-dollar seafood export industry remains infested with human rights abuses despite government pledges to stamp out slavery in its fishing industry, according to research by Human Rights Watch. 4 years after damning revelations of chattel slavery aboard Thai fishing boats linked to seafood exported and sold by major retailers around the world, the new Human Rights Watch report says that rights violations in one of Thailand's most export industries continues unabated, including forced labour and widespread human trafficking. For the report, Human Rights Watch conducted interviews with 248 current and former Burmese and Cambodian fishermen, as well as Thai officials, boat owners, local activists and United Nations agency staff over a 2-year period in all of Thailand's major fishing ports. It documented how migrant fishermen from Southeast Asia continue to be routinely trafficked onto fishing boats, prevented from leaving or changing employers, and are often not paid for their work or are paid less than the minimum wage. Reforms that have been put in place are still largely cosmetic, said Brad Adams, the director of Human Rights Watch in Asia. Forced labour is routine. The workers we interviewed described being trafficked onto ships, trapped in jobs they couldn't leave. Physical abuse, lack of food, long hours and awful working conditions. The worst thing for many of them was not being paid. The psychological harm and the final indignity was the hardest to bear. As you know, a major investigation by The Guardian in 2014 had exposed brutal cases of slavery aboard Thai fishing vessels, and these fed into the supply chain of prawns sold in supermarkets in the UK, Europe and the United States. Reforms included the European Union imposing a yellow card on Thailand under its illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing framework, the IUU, threatening to ban Thai fisheries imports if the government failed to clean up its fishing industry, including labour rights violations. And the Thai government responded with a broad programme of reforms, including new laws to regulate and improve working conditions. A port-in, port-out system was also created to require boats to report for inspections, as well as limiting time at sea to 30 days. However, Human Rights Watch said earlier this year in its report that although some progress had been made, the persistence of trafficking and forced labour on fishing boats illustrated that many of the reforms were cosmetic. It said that the labour inspection regime was largely a quote, theatrical exercise for international consumption, and that in 2015, Thailand failed to find one single case of forced labour in inspections of fishing crew amounting to 474,334. I want to tell you about a case in America which has not anything to do with fishing, but it's an important case to understand about consequences when supply chains become tainted, abused by those who profit from slavery. It's called the Signal litigation. And basically, you remember Hurricane Katrina and the devastation of the south coast of America. Well, Signal was a US construction company which used the US government's guest worker program to import nearly 500 men from India to work as welders, pipe fitters, and in other positions to repair damaged oil rigs and related facilities. Some were sent to Mississippi and some to Orange, Texas. The workers each paid labour recruiters and a lawyer between $10,000 and $20,000 in recruitment fees and other costs after the recruiters promised good jobs, green cards, and a permanent US residency for them and their families. Most sold property or plunged their families deep into debt to pay the fees. When the plaintiffs arrived at Signal shipyards, they discovered they wouldn't receive the green cards or permanent residency that had been promised. This was in 2006. Signal forced them to each pay $1,000 a month to live in isolated, guarded labour camps, where as many as 24 men shared a space the size of a double-wide trailer. The workers also faced disparagement because of their race or nationality, and none of Signal's non-Indian workers were required to live in the company housing. The Southern Poverty Law Centre brought an action on behalf of a number of those men, and it was litigation that was fiercely fought by Signal. Signal said that its recruiter had misled it and that it had brought separate proceedings against its recruiter. But that was found not to be correct in terms of the knowledge of Signal and what was going on underneath its nose. And after a 7-year battle, culminating in a 4-week trial, a federal jury in New Orleans awarded $14 million in compensatory and punitive damages to 5 of those Indian guest workers. This was in February 2015. So 5 were taken as a test case to go forward, with others to follow. The judge found that the Signal, as well as the businesses owned by New Orleans lawyer Malvern C. Burnett and an India-based recruiter, Sachin Dhawan, engaged in labour trafficking, forced labour, fraud, racketeering and discrimination, and that one of the victims was subject to false imprisonment and retaliation. As the minister said, the risk of suicide is high in these cases, and one worker was so distraught when the premises that they were forced to live in were raided by Signal's guards to try to have the men deported for having made complaints, that one of the workers had tried to commit suicide. Signal gave a public apology, deploring its actions and the treatment of the workers, and filed for bankruptcy. So what is going on in the maritime industry when it comes to slavery? The Global Slavery Index Report 2018 shed some light on this, that despite the recognition that modern slavery occurs in fishing industries in most parts of the world, reliable estimates on the prevalence of modern slavery across the sector are few. As in other industries where the use of forced labour has been uncovered, forced labour in fisheries is to some extent driven by the motivation to reduce costs in a relatively low-tech, labour-intensive and low-profit industry. Fishers can be lured into situations of modern slavery by seemingly legitimate employment opportunities, but once recruited find themselves unable to leave because of the threat of violence towards themselves or their family, physical confinement on and offshore, withholding of wages, and the debts they incur through the recruitment process. The Signal case should shine some light on what is happening in all of these fisher cases too. The nature of offshore fishing, particularly for distant water fleets, can make escape from such situations impossible for months or years at a time. The occurrence of labour exploitation and modern slavery in the fisheries of some countries are well documented. For example, we know about the Thai fishing industry, but the research has not been also carried out in such great detail into other countries in an equivalent manner. However, we have seen in the media reports of modern slavery and labour abuses aboard American, British, Chinese and Taiwanese vessels in recent years. So how does this impact on supply chains? So according to the Global Slavery Index, they mapped 3 different tiers. The top 20 fishing countries provide over 80% of the world's fishing catch. And slavery in these nations would therefore profoundly impact on the degree to which slave-dependent seafood exists in the global supply chain. The research by the report identified China, Japan, Russia, Spain, South Korea, Taiwan and Thailand as being at high risk of modern slavery in their respective fishing industries, characterised by a high proportion of catch taken from outside their own waters at a greater distance from home than average, by poor governance, including high levels of unreported catch, and by higher than average levels of harmful fishing subsidies. Except for Spain, instances of serious labour abuses were documented in those countries. And combined, those 7 countries make up 39% of the world's catch. A second group comprises smaller developing countries with primarily domestic or geographically local fisheries, including Chile, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Mexico, Morocco, Peru, the Philippines and Vietnam. These tend to fish at home, have low levels of harmful subsidies, but have low catch values, low GDP, and high levels of unreported catch. Those countries, 9 countries, generate 31% of the world's catch. Then the third group is the group that is not at the moment being considered, is considered low risk of slavery, including Denmark, Iceland, Norway, and the US, which are characterised by low levels of unreported catch, high value catches, high per capita GDP, and those 4 countries generate 12% of the world's catch. The bottom line is that in reality, seafood sold to consumers is typically a mix of domestic and imported product, and it can be difficult to distinguish between the two. Analysis of seafood imports to Europe and the US suggests that when imported and domestically caught fish are combined in local markets, the risk of purchasing seafood contaminated with modern slavery increases approximately 8.5 times compared to domestically caught fish. So I'll leave it to my expert colleagues now to discuss their fields which shed light on this dramatically vulnerable area for modern slavery. And I ask you again this question. If it wasn't about you being caught or your business being caught, but it was about doing the right thing, what would you do? Thank you.